Very cool. Well, hi guys. Thanks for joining us. And we are back in the dojo and just getting started and waiting for the internet to smooth out. It's great to see everyone here, and Carcy and Carla and You Bring Fire and Nancy from Vancouver. Thanks so much. Let's see, Peter. Awesome. And then Tracy and Pablo. Hey, David, DJR is here. That's great to see you from Western Massachusetts. Not too far. Excellent. So how are you doing today, Jason?
Good. I'm doing well.
Great. Excellent.
It's been a bit of a crazy day. I actually just recorded an episode of the Boagworld podcast, which is a great web design podcast. And I was supposed to be on there talking about like design process and tools. And we ended up spending 20 minutes talking about variable fonts because Paul didn't know what they were. It was awesome. Completely derailed him.
That's great. When is that episode going to be up?
That will be out a week from Thursday.
Very cool. I'll have to check it out. Unless you're going to cover that stuff today. So if not, we'll just tune in today.
I am going to mention some stuff about that today. So that's good.
That's really exciting. So hey guys, so I'm glad that you joined us. We're just getting started. Please do me a favor and share out the event. You can use the URL or you can use any of the share buttons if you find one. I don't even know. They keep changing the UI on this thing, so I don't even know where they are now. Hey, Victoria, it's good to see you. So yeah, let everyone know that we're just getting started. I'm here with Jason Pamental, and he is in Providence, Rhode Island, in a basement, in the secret basement, working on variable fonts. Right? Is that where you are, Jason? You're in the secret basement?
Yeah, it is. It is the secret basement where I make all sorts of crazy experiments with variable fonts, many of which are actually supplied by DJR because he's awesome.
Yes, that's right. Love you guys. That's awesome. Okay, so hey, David, how are you doing from North Carolina? Excellent. It's good to see everyone. So again, let everyone know we're just getting started. We've got about over 80 people registered. We want to make sure that no one misses what's going to happen today. Jason is warning me that we might have quite a few questions, and I can already see they're starting to pile up. We will keep the questions to the end if that's okay. If you have any quick notes or anything you want to chat about in the chat bar to the right, feel free to do that. Otherwise, put your questions on the bottom, and this way people who are watching the replay can catch the answers afterwards. Okay, so welcome to Typography Dojo, and welcome back as we are now 2018. We're lining people up. We're kicking off with Jason Pamental, and thank you again, Jason, for joining us today.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
I'm in Los Angeles, which is nice and sunny. How are things in Rhode Island?
It is cold today. It was, I think, 22 degrees Fahrenheit when I went out this morning. So it was about -5 for the people north of the border and elsewhere in the world.
Oh my!
Yeah, it was a little chilly. That's my dog walking time, so I always end up outside then. I get a nice sunrise, but it's a little frigid sometimes.
A little cold. Well, that's why you're in the basement. So
yep, I've got the space heater going. I've got a nice cup of tea. Feeling all ready to go.
Oh, so we're going to get all cozy and talk about variable fonts. So I'm really excited about this talk today. Jason, can you introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure. Well, I'm Jason Pamental. I've been working on the web for over 20 years and run a design and development team at a company called Isovera just outside Boston, where we do primarily Drupal-based websites. And I do a lot of speaking and writing and experimenting about web typography. I've been doing that for a bunch of years now, since about 2011. Spoken all over the place. I wrote a book for O'Reilly called Responsive Typography, and written a few other articles here and there, and was fortunate enough to be in Warsaw in 2016 at A-Type-I when variable fonts were introduced. And I have to admit that was that sort of goes in my list of moments over my career of things that I felt were incredibly significant. And that was that's something that I still believe, and I think it's going to be one of the most significant developments in the web.
Wow.
I'm going to talk a whole bunch about why, but it keeps renewing my interest. When Typekit launched in 2009, it really kind of rekindled my interest in designing for the web, because I could finally bring all of the things I loved about typography that really allows so much greater design freedom on the web and creativity, and this takes it to a whole other level. So it's like the career being reinvented over and over again. It's amazing.
Well, I know there's a lot of interest about it, not only in the speaking engagements that you've been doing lately, and also the podcasts, but there's a lot of type designers in the room today. So thank you guys for joining us. So, Jason, shall we get started?
Yeah, sure. And actually, just a note for the type designers. This was really an eye-opener for me at TypeCon when I gave an earlier version of this talk, how many type designers came up afterwards just to say, thank you, I sort of see a point to this format now, because I know, like somebody mentioned earlier about multiple masters, and then there's TrueType GX. There have been other attempts at this in the past, but the web wasn't there. And the web is what makes this so compelling. And that's so why I love doing these things that are with sort of focused on these different audiences. And I think type designers need to know how much those of us in the web are craving this, and how transformative it's going to be. There really is a good reason, a very compelling use case for them in this format, in this medium, that I think we're only just scratching the tiniest bit of the surface. But we need to get everybody excited about it, because without the type, we can't do the stuff.
Right.
And so that's why I really appreciate the chance to talk about it with more of a type design crowd. It's great.
Too. And I'm so sorry. I don't know. There's some noise outside of my window. Can you hear that? No.
A little bit, but not
Yeah,
bad.
I love it. Okay, great. Excellent. All right. So whenever you're ready to get started,
Okay.
let's jump into it. If it gets really noisy, I'll just turn off my microphone.
Okay.
Excellent.
Is my screen coming through okay?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. Actually, I'm just going to pause for a second and hide that.
Okay.
Sorry. Hold on.
Okay.
Okay. I had to get rid of that little bar on the bottom. It was covering up the bottom of the slides. So variable fonts and the future of typography. I've tried to package this up in a few different stories that I think will help people relate a bit to some of the challenges that variable fonts address. And I'll skip a little bit of the intro because I think people have figured it out by now who I am. I've carried on enough about that. But I think that it would be good to sort of set the stage about how I think of myself. I've been a designer and a technologist and a strategist over the years, but my own personal passion, and something that I've found to be pretty central to a lot of the work that I do, is understanding type and its use on the web. And I do qualify that because I think there are a lot of people that are better typographers in a more traditional sense than I mean, many people. But there are particular things about the application and use of type on the web and on digital platforms that are a little different. And I think that that's where I have a little bit different perspective and feel a little bit more sense of authority there, I guess. But so I thought, in giving a little bit of an understanding of where I'm coming from, I arrived at this descriptor because I was finally able to bring my love of type to my love for the web a few years ago, and started to figure out good ways of doing that. And variable fonts themselves, which I'll explain a bit more about in a few moments, became this sort of central piece of that blend of design and technology, art and science that I really love about the web, and focused in this one little area of interest. So let's look at some of the basics, and this is honestly why most people would find anything interesting in following me on social media, is mainly because of these two. So this is Tristan on the left and his cousin Tilly on the right. We've had Tristan since he was a puppy, and Tilly we just adopted just over a year ago, and she is actually a cousin of Tristan's. And this is where we go walking in the morning. This is over at Turner Reservoir. And I thought that it might be good to set the stage a little bit and talk about some type terminology. And they were pretty useful in that capacity too. So we can talk about things like width and weight and X height. And of course, there's always slant. These are all axes of variation. And we're going to talk a bit more soon about exactly why that's important. But we have to remember the central thing that we're trying to deal with is the fact that the web is covered in words and some cat videos, but the words are really a little bit more prevalent. And the problem is the way that they are set and used on the web is often a little uneven in the level of care that's applied. But if we go back through history and start to look at the origins of written and then printed communication, there was a lot of care and effort that went into this. And over centuries, we got better and better. And when you look at the beauty of a piece like this, there was no accident that it was set the way it was set, and it's decorated the way that it's decorated. And the importance of the message being conveyed is unmistakable. Again, coming forward a little bit into more printed communication, that care has been translated into the beautiful tail of that Q and the ligatures that are in use, and still having that illustrated capital. It's really a gorgeous piece. And coming forward even into more everyday printed pieces like this Rockwell Kent illustrated Moby Dick with this beautiful initial capital. Keith Houston's book about the book. Again, all of these details, this evolution and sophistication of our communication style as manifest in printed pieces shows the evolution of type over time and its application. And that has only grown into all of these beautiful extra, appropriate and well-used features. And we don't want to lose that. And we have to remember that the practice of typography over hundreds of years has been continually honing our ability to amplify the meaning of the words that we're trying to convey. Every time we accept just okay, then it's going to lessen those words' impact. And we want to make sure that as we move to an ever more digital world and landscape, that we don't lose all of the lessons that we've learned over the past centuries. So this was published a little over a year ago, and that really made me sad because it's this whole big thing. This was on the Atlantic Monthly, so it's not a nothing publication. This is a pretty well-known piece. It was pretty widely circulated because a lot of people stop at, we just managed to get it on screen, rather than going a little bit further to make sure that it's presented well on screen. So we see a lot of straight up and down hash marks and a lot of poorly set headlines and poorly set body copy, things that could be made better, but haven't had that extra little bit of care applied. And I do want to point out the irony that this publication does get apostrophes and quotation marks right, because they did take the extra time to do it. So the internet shouldn't be killing off typography. It can be better, and we can apply technology to add the touches that we might otherwise miss and have it encoded in a system. That's what the real value of the web is. We still have to take care in the design, but we want to rely on the systems to help enforce the style and the overall design system wherever possible. So I try and go back for a quiet respite, take a few deep breaths, and then start to think about how can we do this better. And one of the first steps is starting to think through what defines good typography to you as the designer. And so here we're thinking about proper quotation marks, hyphenation, use of ligatures, and other proper typographic symbols for fractions instead of regular numerals divided by a slash, something like large initial caps. Whatever defines good typography to you for the particular piece that you're working on. It's good to kind of quantify that and then start to look at how can these things be applied well on the web. So this brings us to the first story that I wanted to relate. And I've cutely tied these things up with dragons, because at the time when I wrote this initially, it was when the 7th season of Game of Thrones was still on. So it seemed pretty topical at the time. But the first dragon is education about typography in the first place. So I studied graphic design and moved into the web, but an awful lot of people who work on the web as designers never studied graphic design. So they may not have had the benefit of learning about type and its application and use. And so they've arrived here. We know we can use fonts, but they may not know how to use them well. So we have to think about the differences between typography in print and digital and see what we can and can't do. So there are a lot of things that we can't control about the web, but there are a lot of things increasingly that we can. This is what it looked like when I started. This is a careful recreation of the web circa 1994, and pretty much what it looked like when I designed my first website. You couldn't set a typeface, you couldn't change the background color, and you couldn't limit a width. Things were just sort of there.
It was responsive though, right?
Well, it's fluid. I wouldn't
Fluid,
say
okay.
it's actually responsive.
Okay.
You really want to get nitpicky about it.
Okay.
But things really improved over the next few years, and we were able to set something with a white background, limit the width of something, and for better or for worse, decide that we want it to display in Arial. Take that however you like. Coming forward a few more years, we had the advent of Typekit and @FontFace and the widespread support of real fonts on the web. I did skip over about 12 years of web history for very good reason. For anyone who ever tried to use SIFR or Cufon, you'll know what I'm talking about. It was not a good time to be trying to practice good typography on the web. The problem is, as we get here, we're able to get all of this beautiful design details, but that comes at a cost. So here you can see we've got a nice initial capital, and this is a screenshot of an actual web page. We've got nice ligatures, we've got proper quotation marks, we have things like hyphenation, section marks, the first line of a paragraph automatically set in small caps. All of those things are at a system level, meaning those are in the CSS. All you've got to do is drop in some text and it will take on these same stylistic characteristics. And that's really important in the age of things like WordPress and Drupal and other content management systems, where people who are not designers are publishing lots of content. This can ensure that that content is still well set. The problem, and also we can adapt that. So here's where we are getting into more truly responsive design. You'll notice that the initial cap in the large screen is 3 stories, and it's 2 stories in the small screen. And the proportional scale of the main heading is much smaller on the little representation of the font size on the right, so that you get better line wraps and a little bit more appropriate level of differentiation between a heading and the body copy. But you don't lose any of the implied meaning. You still know what the title is. It doesn't have to be physically as big as it is on the desktop. So these are all aspects of things we can do on the web now with web fonts and open type features and responsive design that looks great. It's a nice sustainable system. We can provide as much care and finesse to the typography as you could in print, or at least pretty close. But it's not without the implications, and that's where we get to dragon number 2. And that main implication that I'm talking about is performance. So this is our second dragon. And what we have to remember is that it doesn't matter how nice the fonts are, how well designed the page is. If it doesn't show up, then it really doesn't matter. Because this is a truth on the web today. And that is, doesn't matter if it's mobile or desktop. It's actually no difference now, according to Google's research. You have about 3 seconds before you lose 53% of your audience or more if things haven't shown up. And the problem is all the web browsers out there have adopted a 3-second timeout in waiting to display any content at all.
Wow.
While web fonts are loading.
Wow.
Exactly. So that is a real potential problem. And that's why on a slow connection on your phone, especially, you'll see a blank page and maybe some underlining waiting for that font to load. And it was only relatively recently that in Safari on iOS that they put a timeout in at all. So you could be waiting around 30 seconds. If the web font hasn't loaded, you get no content. That's a critical problem. Speed really does matter in terms of getting something on the screen. So we have to be mindful and responsible in what we're asking of our users in order for them to actually see the content that they came here for, because the content really is the reason they're here. The design of it is extra. I mean, we have to be honest about that. So what ends up happening is if we want to use all 18 different weights and variants of Open Sans, we end up loading 549K of font data. And that, by most measures, is pretty unacceptable. On a small screen, on a slow connection, that could be 30, 40 seconds, over a minute, just waiting for fonts. Never mind all of the rest of the stuff. Because the fonts don't exist in a vacuum. You've got HTML, you've got CSS, you've got JavaScript, you've got images. All of these assets add up to what could be a significant amount of time. And for people who are paying for bandwidth on their phone, real money. That's another thing that people can't forget about. Just because you might have an unlimited data plan, a good portion of the country does not. So we need to be really careful. And what ends up happening is this. We end up pulling back in our design. So we don't use quite as many weights and variants. It might not look that different, but as designers, we know. And we know that we're not articulating meaning and intent quite as effectively in order to achieve this smaller download, this 87K of font files, when we're only using 4 different weights and variants instead of all 18. Now, that may be a bit of an artificial illustration, but you take my point. We would really be better off in our visual communication if we were a little bit freer to vary weight, width, slant, all these different characteristics that that we would like to have at our fingertips in order to convey the meaning behind a design more effectively. So these are some of the trade-offs that we end up having to make. Now, consider this for a moment, because now it's not also just about what you're doing, but what about what people are doing across the whole web? Google has served about 26 billion instances of Open Sans in the past week. And that number's probably gone up because this stat is now a few months old. But that's across over 20 million different websites. And the way the web works is that if you go visit a website that uses Open Sans from Google Web Fonts, and then you go to another website that is also using Open Sans, you might not have to request that font download again because it's coming from the same place. It's being served by Google, not by the website that you were just visiting. If it's the same weight and variant, then you don't have to download it again. But I might prefer to use a 300 weight and somebody else might choose a 400 weight for their body copy. So you, the user looking at those two sites, doesn't get the benefit. You still have to download both files. That also has a cost to Google. Google is now serving these 26 billion files instead of a much smaller number if we were all using the same thing. That leads us to where we might find some real value. And this is what was introduced in September of 2016 at A-Type I in Warsaw. And this is variable fonts. Wow, we finally had them. This is the first time the music actually worked.
Oh, we can't hear it.
Oh, well, that's a bummer.
Sorry.
I guess I'm the only one who's hearing the clip from Enter Sandman. Well, it's just that musical intro. That's so funny. It's like the first time it ever works, and I'm the only one who can hear it. Oh, well. So, variable fonts I'll illustrate here. This page is using every single weight and variant I could find of Eson, which is a beautiful typeface, but 619K and 30% of this very simple web page is download. So this is without all the other stuff that would normally be there on a more dynamic site like jQuery and lots of images and all this other stuff. But 600K is a lot. Most people will try and guide you towards 100 to 150K worth of font files, absolute max. I think that should be a little bit more debatable, but still, that's more of the general guideline. Now here is that same page using Lovette by CJ Dunn. And this is using 74K, and that's it. So that's using 2 variable fonts, an upright and an italic. And these are relatively early versions of these, so there's probably some more optimization, a few more characters, but still 2 files to get a similar level of variation in the type that we're using in the page. It's a beautiful readable typeface that also can create some really interesting substantial headlines, and it's using 2 files. 74K, it's only about 12 to 15%. So about an 85% savings in file size over what we looked at before, without any significant trade-off in the design language that we're able to achieve.
I
so
see. My
2
mind
dragons.
is blowing right now. Oh my God.
So let's look at what that really means. And here we get to feature DJR. So this is Gimlet. This is one that David Jonathan Ross gave me to play around with. And that page that I was playing around with previously that used 549K of open sans, I was able to do with a single file. And I'm totally drawing a blank on how big that file was. And this was also something that he gave me about a year ago. So I know that it's been optimized much more than that since then. But if you just look at all the variability that we have in width and weight, it's really pretty remarkable what we're able to achieve. So let's define it. A variable font, as John Hudson put it, is a single font file that behaves like multiple fonts. So in all of these things that we've been talking about, all of those different widths and weights of Eson, that was 26 different files that you would have to download. Or with Open Sans, that was 18 different files, whereas this was just 1. And to steal another illustration from Nick Sherman, this is another way of looking at it, a single font file that could represent this typeface in all of these different widths and weights. And here's another way to look at it across some of these different axes of variation. So axes of variation mean different axes along which this typeface can change from thick to thin, from narrow to wide, slant, or true italics, even with glyph substitution. Optical size, which I'll come back to because it is just really remarkable and one of my favorite things about this format. And grade, which is also another really interesting thing that you can play around with. Now, on this page, we've got fonts like Output Sans from DJR, Lovette from CJ Dunn, Amstelvar from David Berlow and Type Network. These are all ones that are, well, Amstelvar is an open source one. CJ and DJR were kind enough to give me ones that they were working on to play around with. And I want to talk a little bit about how each of these things works and why you would want to use them, because some of them are just a replacement for existing ways of working with fonts, but a couple of them are really something that we've never been able to do with digital type before. And that's where we start to get into areas that variable fonts enables us to do things that really challenge just the whole notion of what we mean when we say good typography. And I think that's what's so compelling about the future that we have with variable fonts. So here's another example of one in action. This was recorded on the Access Praxis website right out of the browser. So this just gives you a brief look at how different things could be in terms of width, weight, and slant. And this was playing with this right in a web browser and just doing a little screen recording. So if type is the voice of our words, as Beatrice Ward once so famously put it, that voice has just become a chorus. And this is where things start to get pretty exciting. And as I mentioned this for the first time on the day that the 7th season of Game of Thrones came to a close, you can never forget Dragon number 3, at your peril. So Dragon number 3, in my mind, is the context of the user. So in this case, I'm talking about small screen, but that's not the only consideration. So here's that same sample web page, shrunk down to about the size of an iPhone 7-ish, and without any other anything other than just sort of overall typographic scale to make the design more appropriate for that small screen. Now here's doing the same thing with Gimlet. And again, this is a pretty early version of it, but what you'll notice is not only did the width change, the weight change and the size, but also the width. I was able to get easily 10 to 12 more characters per line, so you have a much more readable line of text without really sacrificing the readability. And you will have to excuse a little bit some of the spacing things in there. I'm sure DJR is horrified that I'm showing this, but this was a pretty early version of it. And you know, individual character spacing and all that stuff is much better in the more recent ones. But just the fact that we can do all of these things so easily is just absolutely incredible, and I think worth it to show. Here's a couple other examples looking particularly at small screen. And this is where I think we really have so much to gain in adapting the type for the medium in which it's being consumed. So this is, excuse me, looking at stuff. I think this was all, I don't remember, I think, I'm trying to remember which typefaces I was using for this, but I think a lot of it was using Emstelvar. But watch what happens with the width of this, especially notice the rag on the right with the German text. When we make those characters slightly narrower, look how much smoother it is on the right. Now I know there's some weird things going on with the glyph substitution up in the headline, so don't be too hard on me there. But the important thing here, and this is in with Lovette, getting that more readable line length is really important the more people are actually consuming content on a smaller screen. So by making those characters just slightly narrower, we greatly increase the readability and therefore the user experience. And to take that a step further, in thinking about users that might have an accessibility concern like low vision, we can use grade to slightly increase the weight of that text without reflowing it. And that could also be applied in a low light scenario. So if this were within an app and you have an ambient light sensor, you could make the text more readable without reflowing the design. So these are, again, things that make the experience better for the user without changing anything else about the design and without loading any other assets. So that's a huge win for the user without any performance penalty. So those 3 different dragons are all pretty well handled. So let's talk about support, because I know it's probably what a lot of people are questioning about whether or not they can really use this right now. And it is getting better by the day. iOS shipped support for variable fonts within the OS and therefore extension across all of the browsers this fall with iOS 11. It also shipped full support in High Sierra in the OS and also in Safari, also in September. In October timeframe, roughly, we had Chrome ship with full support on Mac and Windows, and it's in active development in Edge and Firefox, both slated to ship in a few months. So we have OS level support in Mac and Windows. We also have application support in the latest versions of Adobe Illustrator and Photoshop. And then across Android in Chrome as well. So there's a tremendous amount of progress that's going on. Rich Rudder and the clever folks at ClearLeft just launched the website for the Ampersand Typography Conference using variable fonts. And he wrote a great article on Medium about that experience of what they had to figure out to do something in the real world. There will be a bunch more coming soon. I can guarantee it. There are a lot of people starting to look very carefully at this because of all of these considerations of performance and design and user experience all coming together. And because in CSS you can use the @supports feature detection, you can safely put it in production and only load these variable fonts in web browsers that can actually support it. So you can start to future-proof your site and experiment with them without compromising the overall experience that people are getting in older browsers right now. So thinking about the future and what we might do with all of these things being available, I wanted to take a moment to look at a bunch of news websites. So these are all pretty well-known news sites. These are some of the biggest ones in the world. And I think a lot of people would have a pretty hard time identifying more than one or two. And what we've done on the web over the years is optimize everything for any content. And that's a shame. We've lost the notion of art direction or real creative direction and emphasis expressed through type, because we've had to worry about just getting the content there in the first place. So creating that design system and then adding content, as opposed to in newspapers where they might have the content and then design it and print it. We have to bring all those things together because it's performance and design and typography is what adds up to the whole user experience. This was not left to good enough. There was no way that that was going to be acceptable. And typography is the central piece to anything that's going out on the web or on a mobile application, because it's the design, it's the communication, it's an intentional act to convey meaning. And so if we look again, hello, there we go. I want to start with these printed pieces. These newspapers really knew how to use type to guide your eye. And if you look at all of these different examples, there is no one size fits all. They use typography to convey importance and meaning in the hierarchy of this design. And it is specific. And this is the key piece. So what we looked at previously in those newspaper websites, and with all due respect to everybody who works on those, it is a terrifically difficult thing to do, to create a design system that can handle any content. But I posit that that is only part of what we need to do. We also need to be able to design for the specific, like this or this, and be able to build those things into the content management system. And when we have something like variable fonts, that gives us a tremendous facility to do just that, to allow someone to select different words and add different levels of emphasis and tweak the shapes of the letters themselves to actually create a design that is specific to that headline that can still work across devices. We need to get graphic design back in the room. I think it's really critical that we stop thinking of this as a dirty word in the web industry. It really has been left behind, and I think there's a tremendous amount of history and understanding that needs to come back. If we look at these magazine covers, and just through brief examination, I didn't have access to the original design files. It was pretty easy to identify multiple typefaces and numerous different weights that are used in order to guide people's eye and convey levels of importance and meaning. And looking at Science Magazine, trying to do the same and bring it over to the website. This is a much earlier version of the Science Magazine site that I went back and checked out where they had over 9 weights being loaded, and it was 600 or 700K worth of font data that was being downloaded. That did not provide the most optimal experience, but we could get that same level of typographic vocabulary and much better performance if we were to replace that with a variable font. And I wanted to point these things out just to stress that it's normal in graphic design to use type to convey hierarchy and use it in a very broad range of shapes and sizes. And I really think it's important that we try and bring that back to the web, where we can actually do that in a performant manner now. So being able to do things like this with a single typeface, and this I ended up going on to build into a demo in Drupal where you could actually, in the content management system, go change the width and weight of that word 1 and do it right in an admin interface and hit save and come back, and it just works. So we could actually create tools that editors and designers would have to use without having to custom code things. They would actually just be working on it right through the admin system itself. And here's an image of the ampersand site, because I think they did a really beautiful job. And finally, I wanted to show you another example that I was playing around with in CodePen. And this is all available for anybody that just goes to codepen.io/jpamental. You'll find a collection of variable font experiments there. And this one is actually using CSS variables and calculations to smoothly transition the scale of the type. And this is, again, using AmstelVar as the example typeface. And if you watch what happens as it gets narrower, the width changes, the size changes, the weight changes, all of those things smoothly together as the page is scaling. And this is, again, it's all live in a browser. So this is stuff that really works. And a lot of this stuff is pretty easy to steal it from here and go adapt it to your own stuff. That's why I make all of this stuff public. So better design, better performance, better experience, all of those things together in this new technology. And I really can't say enough about how much I believe this is going to transform how we design for the web. So thank you.
Yay, excellent. Oh, that was great. Oh my gosh, my mind is blown.
Thank you. And so I wanted to call out Esson and Trade Gothic were really fantastic ones to work with, but Gimlet and Output Sans from DJR, Lovette from CJ Dunn, and AmstelVar from Type Network were all the variable fonts that I was playing around with. And axis-praxis.org by Lawrence Penny is the absolute definitive playground for you to go and see this stuff in action. Go there in Chrome, go there in Safari, and play. You'll be able to switch type out into different variable font typefaces, and it'll automatically show you what sliders are available to play around with those axes. And it'll really give you a much better sense of all of the things that you can do.
Great, thank you. I'm going to close the presentation if
Sure.
that's okay with you. Okay,
Yeah.
great. So then you can see us again. Yeah, so thank you. Thank you. Oh my gosh, that was so good. So now I understand. Now my mind is blown and I'm like, oh, now I get it. Okay. So
That's the whole purpose of this. That's exactly what I want to do. Just get people thinking about it.
Got it. Okay. So I know we have some questions piling in. I do have just one tiny question. All right.
Sure.
So you're saying that in one font, it now takes the place of many fonts, correct?
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the weights. All right. So this might be just a stupid type nerd question, but so do you see that we won't be even calling them typeface families anymore? We'll just be calling them fonts?
That's probably a better question for DJR to answer than me, but because I'm not a type designer. But it does. It's one of the things that I find so compelling about this is, as much as sort of on the other side of that, I feel like it can challenge what we mean by good typography. But it's also, like you say, it sort of challenges the notion of what are you calling what it is you're designing. And that, one thing I didn't mention that it's really important is that you can only vary things that the typeface designer chooses to expose for variation. So this isn't a distortion. It is so that you, instead of having 64 different fonts that you export in a particular family, you can export one file and decide how thick and how thin, how light and how heavy. All of those values are expressly set within the font file itself by the designer.
That makes sense. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll jump into the questions.
Sure. Don't let me forget to talk about optical sizing, because that is really, I still think that that's one of the coolest things that this format allows.
You want to talk about that right now?
Sure.
All right, let's do that.
So I suspect that a lot of the people that are watching this know what optical sizing is, but just to give a brief description, the whole premise was that in metal type, what was often done in order to have a typeface be legible at different sizes, what fine details you might have when you set it at 24 point might not either print well or be legible at a physically much smaller size. Let's, for example, 6 point. So what they would tend to do in actually cutting the typeface, they might open up apertures, they might change the size of the bowl, they might change the stroke contrast in order to preserve the intent of the typeface without sacrificing legibility. And as soon as we shifted over to photo typesetting, we lost that because what they did was take one outline and simply scale it. And so photo typesetting and then digital type, we lost this facility to make a typeface more useful at a wider range of sizes, which is why you ended up getting things like Verdana, for example, really doesn't look that great when you make it really big. It's designed to be used at a smaller size. And I'm not saying that Verdana would be better, and I would never presume to say that about Matthew Carter's work, but it's an example where the utility of that typeface was tailored for a particular size range. And that was not necessarily the case when Times New Roman was first drawn.
Okay. So we got
anyway, so I wouldn't finish that. That's available now in the variable axes, and a lot of the browsers are aiming towards making that on by default. So when you scale the type down to equivalent of 12 pixels, it's going to look slightly different than when you look at it when it's 36. And actually, if you look in CodePen, I actually have some examples specifically about that, so you can look at it with optical sizing forced on and off. Okay,
great. Yeah, there's some notes about in the chat. People are asking about variable fonts to be used in InDesign and Illustrator. It looks like InDesign and Illustrator support variable fonts right now.
It's actually Illustrator and Photoshop do.
Oh, Photoshop. Okay.
I don't think they've launched it in InDesign yet, but I suspect it's going to be here soon.
Okay. Great. Let's go through the questions.
Sure.
All right. So if you see any questions that you guys feel you have the same, feel free to vote them up. It's in the tab underneath. I will just start with, let's see. Joel has a question, although this was asked a while ago. I don't know if you saw this before, and does it make sense to answer now is my question. I'm going to ask you. I'm not sure exactly what he's asking.
Well, okay. All right. Actually,
shall I ask it really quick, or just in case?
Let me sort of restate the question, because I think I know what he's getting at.
Okay.
In using viewport units, and viewport units, you can think of VW is viewport width and VH is viewport height. Those are 1/100th of the window size. So it's like a percentage, except it actually works. And one of the interesting things about using viewport units to size type is that you can tie the size of the type to the width of the window. And that has some interesting things that you can do with it. However, it leads to the conundrum that he's experiencing here, where you want to set a Vmax and Vmin, meaning how big can it get and how small can it get. And that is, it's tricky because it's not implemented all that well. The answer that I found is Tim Brown's article on CSS locks.
Okay.
And that the example that I showed in the last slide, that chapter of Moby Dick, is using that technique where there's only really two breakpoints, the low end and the high end of where I want the type to scale, and everything. So it's like the heading, let's say it's sort of freezes at an equivalent of 32 pixels at the low end, and at the high end, I think I let it scale up to 5M or 5 times 16, whatever that is, 80. But it's that it caps at about 12 or 1300 pixels wide. So using this locks technique, the calculation is only in that middle ground. You set it for the minimum at the low end and the maximum at the high end, and then everywhere else in between it scales. So look up CSS locks on the Typekit blog, and then if you go to CodePen and just grab that demo, you'll see I'm using CSS variables and calculations in there, and it's a pretty neat combination to address that minimum and maximum.
Got it. Okay. Much clearer. Got it. Thank you so much for answering that.
Sure.
Thanks, Joel. I'm glad that you're here. So question from Val is, what are your favorite serif and sans serif web fonts?
Oh gosh, that's really tough. It doesn't matter how many times you get asked that.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't really matter. So there's a few that I like for different reasons. I really like Fira Sans because it reminds me a lot of other Eric Spiekermann typeface designs, but it's a little more modern, and I love the fact that it's open source. I love the whole philosophy behind why that was created. It was commissioned by Firefox to use in their phone OS, so it works great on low-res screens, but it's really a nice, well thought out, solid typeface to use across a range of projects. One of the first sans serifs that I really gravitated to was Franklin Gothic. And so there's Franklin Gothic and News Gothic. And then more recently, I kind of fell into Trade Gothic. I really kind of became a fan of those. They share a lot of similar qualities, but Trade Gothic in particular just renders beautifully on the web. I really like that a lot.
Okay, great. Do you know if those are going to be available? I mean, I guess this depends on the type designers, whether they're available in variable versions or not.
I think that we can safely say that, particularly the commercial ones that I just mentioned, Franklin Gothic, News Gothic, Trade Gothic, I can almost guarantee it, because those are popular money-making typefaces. And I know that Adobe and Monotype and Google are all working on tooling to convert their libraries. It may take some time because it will not be something they can fully automate. It will require, they can automate some, but then they've got to get in there and really dig into them in order to really get something out of it. It's only half the battle to get things like width and weight. I think it really only becomes interesting and super useful once you start to get into some of these other axes of variation to make it a really useful typeface. So I think they'll get there. I think it's just going to take a little time.
I think the Gothics will be first. They're easy to, they're already sort of designed for different styles, different weights, and condensed and compressed. Thank you, Val, for asking. Pablo is asking, hello, Jason, what is your opinion on synthetic axis proposal for VF? Those combining multiple axes like width and OPSC, how do you call that?
Well, that's optical size.
Optical size, okay. Yeah. In one virtual new axis.
Well, I think that particular one, I think they're interesting, generally speaking. But I've been reading a lot of these proposals because I'm part of the group that is sort of evaluating them. But something like optical size, I think, is intended to work with the type size at which you're setting it. So generally speaking, it's going to be a number from 12 to 72, and it's supposed to correspond to the size at which it's being set. And that's the idea, regardless of what the width or weight is. I think that adding more and more layers of abstraction in this way, kind of bundling the axes together, you're getting more and more complicated. I can't really say if they're going to be a good idea or not, because it's still so early in putting them into practice. And I think that's the key. And I think we're trying to keep a reasonable pace going in developing typefaces, putting them into use, seeing what makes sense. The Firefox team is doing incredible work in talking to many of us who are actually doing these kinds of experiments and research to build out tools in the browser, so that in the developer tools from Firefox, giving people access to the axes, yeah. To make it more discoverable. I think that it's going to be up to the type designer if they feel that a synthetic axis gives a little bit better control over some of the awkward design space combinations. Don't make this one too thin when you make it also very wide. Those kinds of things are real considerations, because if you say you can do width, weight, and slant, you can't stop someone from pushing all of them to an extreme that might be really illegible. So, and I also, related to that, what I forgot to mention is that we still have the idea of named instances, such as bold condensed. That's the type designer's way of indicating these are good ways to use this. We can still map it back to what we considered, this font, this version, bold condensed or extra light extended, whatever you, and those map to specific points along those axes of variation. The synthetic axes are sort of like that idea of, I want this one to always move in relation to that one. I don't know if that really answers your question, Pablo. I guess it's sort of a depends.
Let us know. Thanks, Pablo, for asking. So Peter's asking, beside Adobe, who else is developing variables? My guess is variable fonts.
Everyone. And I think that what was so interesting is it started with a few individuals who were the most active. And so that's why I keep coming back to DJR and CJ Dunn, because they were the first two that I met who just said, here, I made stuff, here, try it. And they would keep sending me new things to play around with. More recently, I've been starting to collaborate a bit with some people at Type Network. So a lot of individuals are coming out with interesting stuff right now. A few people are starting to sell them. And I know that Adobe, Monotype, and Google are all working on the tooling to produce a much larger body of work by working on ways to convert their existing libraries.
Well, I'm excited to see what people do with it once the tool gets out there. Hopefully, it's not like when Photoshop launched and people were doing all sorts of crazy stuff with it.
Well, you know what? That's job security.
Yes.
Plain and simple. Because, with the whole thing with desktop publishing, with this fear that all the graphic designers would be out of work, it lets a lot of people do a lot of things themselves. And it then accentuates the difference between what the sort of the hobbyist practitioner is going to do with it versus a trained designer. And so it's on us to do good work and make sure that we really learn how to use this stuff.
Right. Yeah, it does separate the men from the boys, per se. Okay, so Tracy is asking, is there kerning built into the fonts based on different combinations of letters? So kerning pairs.
Yep, it is. So this is an evolution of the OpenType specification. So it's all the same things that have been there for kerning and ligatures and stylistic sets. All of those things are still part of the format and can be a part of the variable fonts as well. So that's not different. At some point, we should get David to answer how miserable it's making him to try and do that with the variable axes as well. He'd certainly have a little bit more insight into that, but technically, yes, it's there.
David, if you're interested in jumping on, let us know. If not, it's okay. We'll just keep talking about you on the screen and you can't defend yourself. DJ, we're calling you out. All right. Okay. Thank you so much, Tracy, for asking. Joel's asking, can I self-host variable fonts, or do I need to use a hosted service like Typekit or Google Fonts?
So it's exactly like using any other web fonts. So the answers are, of course, it depends. Can you get it? There are a lot of ones that are on GitHub right now so that you can download them, play around with them, and therefore you would be self-hosting them. They're not available in any of the services yet. I certainly hope I would have heard about it if they were testing it. Hint, hint, anyone working at Adobe. But the idea there is, I'm sure they're working on it. And I know that, one of the big questions is licensing. I think that's one of the biggest difficulties, is thinking through how to license a variable font. Is it the same as a whole family? Is there some middle ground? Because that's the tricky bit, is I can go now and I can just buy the 4 weights and variants I want to use on this site and pay whatever it is I'm going to pay. And it might be 4 or 5 times that amount to buy the whole family. A variable font gives you the whole family all in a single file. Does that mean they'll only sell the whole thing at once? Or is it possible? I mean, it is technically possible. Would they want to do something like sell a variable font that only goes from extra light to regular versus one that goes extra light to extra, so like cut the axes in half to sell it in the range that someone might find useful? All of those things are possible technically. It's a question of how people want to figure out how to sell it. And the choices are going to be different for an individual versus a foundry versus a company like Adobe. But I think that it's easier for them to figure it out in the context of a service than it is individually, perhaps at a company level. Although, individual foundries are going to have their own ideas about it. And, you're here, DJR, so that's why I keep mentioning you. I know that's something that everybody is trying to sort out.
And not even DJR. If anyone else is working on variable fonts, feel free. We would love to hear from you. Thank you, Joel, for asking. So guys, we're going over. It's okay with Jason. Hopefully it's okay with you guys. Maria is asking, do you think other font formats will disappear in the future, or will they coexist with variable fonts?
I don't really see a reason why they wouldn't continue to exist, because I think there's always going to be the case where I need this one weight. That's it. I need it for block quotes. I need it for this headline. I think from the way I understand the process, making a variable font is sort of along the lines of how a lot of people are designing typefaces right now. It's simply dealing with the whole of all of these different variations instead of focusing in on this one particular weight or variant. The file can create either one of those things. This is all open type. It's not so much a different format. It's, I guess, more, is it including everything or just one thing? You could think of it as, a single width or weight will become a variable font that just is very limited in its variability. So it can only do one thing. With that in mind, I think because of the web and because of the way things have evolved, we don't really want to go back to having a different version of a font that gets installed here or there. Things being in the open type format, and then WAF or WAF2 would be better for the web. That simplifies the production of these things quite a bit. So I suspect that there will be the single versus the everything, but hopefully that might be it in terms of the different font formats.
That would make sense. I mean, who wants to buy a whole family if you only need one or two? I mean,
right.
For some of the typefaces that we work with, that would be $1,200 for one variable font. which would be
Right.
outrageous.
Well, and that's typically the way I'm seeing it sold right now is if you buy the whole family, then you get the variable font too, or something like that.
Great. That leads into the next question. So Holland is asking where to find variable fonts.
That's difficult right now, to be perfectly honest. If you go to, like, there are a lot of them listed on the Access Praxis website. And if you pick one of them in the drop-down on the right, that's letting you set the typeface for the block of copy you're looking at, there's usually a little info icon next to it. And if you click on that, it opens up a window and it shows you where it came from. A lot of these early ones are hosted on GitHub. So if you go to GitHub and just search variable fonts, you'll find a whole bunch of things there. So you might find code samples, but you'll also find fonts themselves. And follow Access Praxis on Twitter, follow variable fonts on Twitter, search that hashtag. It's imperfect at the moment. Few of us are working on different ideas there, but it is very much evolving. So it takes a little bit of effort right now, but it'll get better.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Holland, for asking that question. Hopefully that helps. So if you guys don't have any questions, that's great because I have a question. So for variable fonts, do you think that crosses over superfamilies, like from sans serif to serif, or does it really just?
So technically it can. And that's, I think that is a really interesting evolution of this. So if you think about something like Avant-Garde and Lubalin Graph, those are a sans serif and a slab serif that are like one grew out of the other. And they very much belong together. They look lovely in combination. And that would be sort of an ideal candidate, or Museo and Museo Sans. So I mean, like there are ones that I think are relatively natural pairings. Now, the way the format works is it stores the outline of the regular width and weight of the character, and then it stores the point offsets in order to make it thicker, thinner, wider, etc. It would just be another set of points to add to sort of have a bit flip of its sans serif or its serif. But that is more information to store.
Right.
But I think that over time, as people get better at, as type designers are more familiar with it and start to play with those boundaries, actually having those things together in one file might be more practical than it might be right now. And I think that will come down to an experiment on the part of the type designer to see what yields the smaller file. If you want to have those things used in combination, then let's say that individually they're 50K each, but the one that combines them both might be 80K. So that's a net savings of one HTTP request and 20K of data to get this huge, gain in your type vocabulary. That's awesome.
Right.
That may not always work, but I think there's some pretty interesting possibilities there. If you look at Decovar on Access Praxis, you'll see it's a crazy experiment that goes totally over the edge of sane, but you can see the addition of, like, make the terminals rounded, give it serifs, change the shape of the serifs. There's all kinds of things that, again, like the shape of the serifs and the terminals, think about that as an accessibility aid for people with dyslexia. Giving them the control to increase the grade of the text and change the shape of the angle of the terminals to increase the differentiation between like a B and a D and a P and a Q and that sort of thing, could really help people, and without really sacrificing the overall vision of the design or of the typeface or the piece itself.
Well, we are definitely on the forefront of something really exciting, frontier of something exciting, and I don't know where it's going to go, but where can we all follow you to just watch more of what you're exploring and you're experimenting with?
Well, I'm at Pamental on just about everything. Twitter, Instagram, probably the most common things. And if you are going to an event apart in Seattle, I will be speaking there about variable fonts. And then the next week, a bit of jet lag whiplash, I'll be in Berlin for Typo Labs. Back in Germany in the fall for one of the Smashing conferences, and a few events here and there, and then doing more things like this. Hopefully TypeCon and A-Type-I.
That should be fun.
So, yeah, I'll be around.
Great. I mean, so you're everywhere, so it should be easy to catch you. That's great.
It's my mission to make this accessible and of interest to as many people as I possibly can. Graphic designers, developers, type designers, brand owners. I mean, I think everybody can get something out of this.
Right. Well, thank you for what you're doing. That definitely helps.
Thank you for inviting me here. It's really a lot of fun to kind of share all of this. And thank you, everybody, for all your questions.
Yeah, thanks, guys, for joining in. So we're going to wrap up, and then hopefully you have a great rest of your day. You're at Isovera, correct?
Yes.
In 40-degree weather, and hopefully it warms up a little bit for you. Thanks, guys, again for joining us, and we'll see you on the next show. Have a good day. Thank you.
Cheers, everyone. Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.